Creepy Americana, and I'm talking to my friend Justin.
Hello.
We're going to be talking about movies, and Justin's like my go-to film guy, so that's why I thought that he would be perfect for this episode.
That's very heartwarming. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome. And the two movies that I'm going to be talking about are a little bit weird and artsy, and I thought that you would have some interesting things to say about them, whether or not you've seen them. So I think
I certainly hope so, but
yeah.
I guess we'll figure it out.
And then you said you were going to talk about a couple of movies too?
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about something the most recent one I've seen, which is The Killing of a Sacred Deer. It's more of like a psychological horror movie from a Greek filmmaker called Yorgos Lanthimos. Probably just going to talk about Vampire as well.
Yeah, because you watched that relatively recently too, right?
Yeah. I wrote a bit of an essay on it. Yeah.
Vampire is probably like the oldest movie on this list. So
yeah, I think it's by a mile. Yeah.
By a mile. So maybe let's start there. So what's Vampire? What's it about? What's the idea?
Well, so there's a guy he's a pretty important filmmaker in the history of film called Carl Theodor Dreyer. He did The Passion of Joan of Arc, and that's a pretty important silent film, but at the time it wasn't really well received. However, now it's considered a masterpiece, which is kind of how a lot of his films ended up being. He was a little bit ahead of his time, and Vampire follows very much in that vein. It was his first sound film, and he was trying to make something more along the lines of a thriller.
And now, this is something that I think is interesting, and that has come up in a few of my other episodes on podcasts, just because it's something that's important. And it's kind of, is there a distinction between horror and thriller? Is thriller a subgenre of horror? Are they two separate things? What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question, if only because there's plenty of things that I would consider horrifying that would fall more in the thriller area, like The Silence of the Lambs. A lot of people don't consider that a horror film, but honestly, any time Hannibal Lecter or Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of him is on screen, it is pretty
horrifying.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people call something like a psychological thriller or a thriller in general when it's not something like a jump scare or a slasher film. But those films aren't critically acclaimed. They're not the ones that are remembered by,
true.
I guess, the academic sorts, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, how many theses are there out on Friday the 13th or something?
Probably none that are published, at least. Yeah.
I would actually be really interested to see if there were any.
That would be really interesting.
I'd read it. Yeah. So,
I
mean, that's something that I kind of struggle with too, because there's definitely certain things that I guess would be considered thrillers, but I would still watch them and consider them to be horrifying or terrifying and scary, because they kind of tap into something that's a little more maybe esoteric, like more of a societal horror or something along that line.
Well, the role of horror films in general have always kind of fed off of whatever's bothering a society at the time.
Yes.
So that's a huge thing. If you look at Night of the Living Dead, that came out, I'm pretty sure, in the heat of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And it had a black protagonist.
Who was killed at the end by a cop, no less.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that obviously was a huge statement for the time. And then if you look at Get Out now, it's kind of sad how
it's still relevant and it's still the same narrative, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been very much a hot button issue in our day and age still. So it's fed into our horror films. And I mean, Get Out was the most successful one of this year by far.
Yes, absolutely true. And it was one of the highest grossing movies of the year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's amazing for a horror film. That doesn't happen. So It's amazing. And I think there's also something to be said about the fact that a large portion of our horror movies right now, and just horror media in general, are zombie movies.
Yeah.
We don't even need to go down that road. Everybody knows what we mean.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is you could probably attribute that to a lot of things. Not being able to trust other people, fear of the unknown. I mean, fear of the unknown kind of is just every horror film.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Vampire, what exactly is the plot there? What's going on in that movie?
Well, this is where it gets tricky with Vampire, just because it's more of a...
It doesn't have a plot line?
I mean, it has a plot line. It's just it kind of drifts from it consistently. It has a lot of tangents. And it was really unusual for the time, because this movie was made in Man, let me make sure I get the year on this one right. I think it was 1932. Let's see here.
So is there like a main vampire person that we're following, or...
Well, you're not really following a vampire for most of the story. You're kind of following this guy. His name's Alan Gray, and it's interesting because it was Carl Theodor Dreyer's first sound film, but there's definitely elements of silent film.
Sure, convention.
Filmmaking. Yeah, exactly. Because it starts up with a title scroll, and, like, giving you, like, some context, and then it goes pretty much right into the movie, and that happens a few times. But it starts off with Alan Gray arriving in this, like a fishing hamlet, essentially. It's like a town off of a river. I think it's a real place.
It's in Germany?
I think it's actually, even though it's Carl Theodor Dreyer is a German, though he didn't live there most of his life, if I'm not mistaken. But it was Courtimpiere. Pronunciation is probably all over the place, and I apologize.
Oh, where is it?
I'm honestly not sure, but it's like a riverside village.
Okay.
At least according to the movie in 1932. At this point, it could be a Hamilton for all I know.
It could not even be there anymore.
Yeah, may have been erased.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he arrives in this fishing village, and essentially what follows for the rest of the film is him just kind of... He was there to study kind of the occult and just all kinds of spooky things. The things you love.
The things I love.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. He's essentially a member of the podcast, but many years back. But he goes there to, I guess, just study the occult, do his own little thing, and he's visited by spirits that tell him that he can't let her die.
And he doesn't know who her is?
Not at the time. It turns out to be a girl that he runs into later in this mansion. Like, there's two twin sisters that are essentially being held by this vampire called Carmilla.
Oh, Carmilla. I know that name.
Yeah, well, the thing is, there's a really interesting history behind this. I say Carmilla with air quotes. Obviously, you can't see the air quotes.
I cannot. No, I can't.
This movie was loosely based off of In a Glass Darkly, which is by, I think, Sheridan Le Fanu. God, that pronunciation is probably terrible. But yeah, it was originally his work. In a Glass Darkly is essentially like this collection of short stories. So Sheridan's In a Glass Darkly was a collection of like horror short stories, and one of them was called Carmilla, which was essentially about...
Lesbian vampire?
Yeah, precisely. It was subtextually and very overtly a story about constrained sexuality. And the movie takes that and runs with it real hard. Because instead of the vampire being young and beautiful, the film's version, who's known as Marguerite, she is old and haggard and just real rude. And she's just like kind of this symbol of death. That's the best way, because I mean, like, obviously old people, close to death.
Yes.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
His adaptation really changes the context of the vampire myth and what it represents, at least to an extent. Obviously, you still have the stuff about vampires being aristocrats who bleed the poor dry, that sort of thing.
And spend all their time up in the castle, they never work, and all that, yeah.
Exactly. A big thing in this movie is that it focuses a lot on memento mori.
Oh, sure, okay.
Yeah. And there's a lot of... it'll just cut. It'll show, like, spirits and skulls and things like that.
Okay. So obviously, like, the little things that remind you that death is always around the corner.
Yeah, precisely. One of my favorite examples of the memento mori, or the use of memento mori in the film, is early on when Alan Gray goes into this warehouse and he sees this hallway of, like, spirits just dancing. I say you see them, but you're seeing their silhouettes. It's meant to represent their presence. You're not necessarily seeing ghosts.
Okay.
Looking at the shadows, they're kind of dressed in, like, upper-class type folk from, like, the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s. But they're all dancing to, like, this, what would be music played at a dinner party in that time. And then that gets interrupted by the score of the film, which is much darker. So it'll go from the music of whatever the spirits are dancing to this, like, dark, booming, like, it sounds like violin score. But
that sounds really interesting.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. And then it continues to go down this hallway, and essentially like it's just a longer shot, and then it goes through the hallway and down, and it shows who you don't know at the time is Marguerite yelling silence to the spirits.
And then it stops?
Yes. And Alan Gray just continues like nothing's really happening. But he essentially explores more of this warehouse and sees a bunch of skulls and skeletons, like almost like a medical display or like trophies. And like stuff like that's throughout the movie. So Carl Theodor Dreyer does a lot of like just really weird cuts from a normal scene to all of a sudden like
something weird like that.
Yeah, like a skull like all of a sudden turning on its own, and then its eyes glowing.
Oh,
yeah.
I think I've seen a gif of that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's a spooky movie, man, like, especially for its time.
Yeah.
What?
No, honestly, it sounds really sophisticated, and that's, it reminds me of this, like, weird kind of pulpy movie that I watched that was, like, from maybe the 60s, and I honestly don't even really know what language it was filmed in. I think it might have been, like, Turkish or something.
Was it Goals?
No, it was, like, a weird lesbian vampire movie. I honestly can't even really explain the plot, but basically they kept cutting to this scorpion for some reason, and then I guess at the end the vampire lady gets killed, and then the scorpion is shown like dead floating in the pool. So it's like the scorpion was like a symbol of her as a vampire. But
that's interesting.
Yeah.
That fits very much in line with this movie.
Yeah, a little bit. So that's really interesting that they actually like used a sophisticated technique, but it was like a very, very bad movie.
Yeah, no, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, like, honestly, watching movies from early on, you said this was in the 60s, though?
Yeah, it was in the 60s.
Well, I guess I can't make the excuse that, movies back then feel so different.
Okay, to be honest, movies from the 60s are really bad. Like, movies from the 40s and 50s were pretty good. Like, they definitely hit, like, a golden spot in the 50s and the 40s and 50s. But then the 60s were just really bad for some reason, and they bounced back in the 70s. I don't know what it is about the 60s. It's just, like, a bad decade.
I don't know, man. There are a lot of international films that, like, came out in the 60s, like, I think La Notte. I have it on my shelf. I just don't know. I'm really bad at pronouncing things. That's gonna
foreign language. Yeah. I know what you're talking about. It's Notte.
Yes, but that's an Italian film. I'm pretty sure it came out in the mid or early 60s.
Do you know who directed it?
It was directed by Michelangelo Antonioni.
Oh, okay. I didn't think I know him.
He's just a really, like, prolific Italian director. He's a big deal in retrospect. I'm not really sure how his work was taken at the time.
Sure.
But I know that people like Ingmar Bergman, Stanley Kubrick really looked up to him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. He was the
Now, was he the one that was, like, he did that really weird, like, torture movie, and he was, like, murdered?
No, that's, I think you're talking about the guy who did Solo or 120 Days of Sodom.
Yep, that's it.
Pasolini, that's who it is, Pasolini.
Okay. There's another guy who does horror movies, and he's Italian. He did Zombie, it's called Zombie, but it's like Zombi, because I guess that's the Italian word for it.
Yeah.
But he's done like a bunch of horror movies, and I just don't really know what time period he was doing them in, but he's like really famous.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with. I know about Zombie, but
Zombie came out in 79, so he must have been doing like 70s and 80s. His name is Lucio Fulci. He's really famous. He's done a lot of horror movies.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with his stuff at all. But in the 60s, like I think it was a bigger time for foreign films than it was for necessarily American films. The 70s were obviously a great time. So many good films in the 70s.
I have to agree.
I don't know, like I'm trying to think of other movies I've seen from the 60s that I really liked.
I mean, there's like Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah, Rosemary's Baby's really good. That's a great horror film.
It sure is. That's why I brought it up.
When a film deals so much with the occult and then like is as menacing and suspenseful as like something like Rosemary's Baby, like you can't tell me that's a psychological thriller. That's a horror film, man. That's an important part of any horror film, is that like there's something that the characters are being changed by the events around them. Like obviously, if you were to see anything that Mia Farrow's character in Rosemary's Baby has to deal with, that's who's in the movie, right? Mia Farrow.
It is, yes.
Okay, if you were to see anything or deal with, like, giving birth to the Antichrist, you'd probably be psychologically affected by it.
I would say so.
I think that maybe when people say psychological thriller, it really just stems from, like, the fact that horror movies still are kind of not recognized as
good cinema.
Yeah, as cinematic of a genre as, say, like, drama or
which
even
is like,
romance.
you know what? Bullshit. Like, because drama is literally everything.
Yeah, no, drama's such a vague
yeah.
term.
It's like I had a student, you know, who's learning English, and they thought drama was another word for, like, TV series because everything's just called drama, and I'm like, no, it means, like, conflict. Like,
yeah,
it's a genre, not a, yeah.
I mean, like, honestly, the only criteria that I could think of that could maybe differentiate a psychological thriller from a horror film, which pretty much just means that psychological thrillers are horror films, is subjectivity of what is horrifying.
Yeah, like, I mean, does it directly involve the occult or not? And you know what? I love the kind of movies that really straddle that line, and it's hard to tell if something really was paranormal or supernatural. Mm-hmm. Because that's so interesting to me. Because, like, I mean, things like The Babadook are, like, so interesting in that sense. Because
yeah, no, I would agree. Definitely.
Was it real? We don't know. But, like, the trauma, the lasting effects are still there. And that's what's interesting.
For sure. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, like, I'm trying to, for some reason I'm struggling to find an example of a film that, like, really straddles that line.
The Babadook was, like, the only one I can think of at the moment.
Yeah, no, I'm blanking real hard on that, but there's so many examples like that.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting way of telling a story. I think there should be more like that, personally. Also, there should be more found footage in general that's, like, not super shitty. Can people get on that, please?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, there's plenty of, I shouldn't say plenty, but there are found footage movies that really use that concept well. The first Blair Witch Project, I think, still holds up to me. I mean, like, that's, even though a lot of people, like, shit on that movie for, you know,
it's kind of mean because, like, honestly, it was the primogenitor of the genre, so it's kind of unfair to be, like, holding that movie to the same standards of movies that are out now. It's like, you wouldn't have those movies if the Blair Witch hadn't done what it did.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, that film is really a triumph of marketing. Like, they did such a good job with that, of, like, I guess, advertising that film, because, I mean, like, they really sold the fact that this was supposed to be found footage, and it worked so well. That
these people really went missing. I mean, they even had, like, missing posters mocked up that were very similar to the missing posters of the Springfield 3, and then those were, like, real people who really went missing, and you could make the case that that's a little insensitive as fuck, because that's, like, still unsolved. But, you know, they didn't know that at the time, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, when it comes to found footage, I would say that, like, there's still a lot of potential in that genre that hasn't been mined yet. But, you know,
I agree.
It's also because a lot of, I think, talented filmmakers don't
want to waste their time on that.
Yeah, they don't get attached to projects like that because they'd rather find something else. And the only example I could think of, regrettably, is when Adam Wingard did the newest Blair Witch.
I liked that one. Did you like it?
I thought it had its moments.
I think it had its moments, too. Like, obviously, spoiler alerts, I guess, if you couldn't tell already. But anyway, when the girl, like, hurts her foot or whatever at the very beginning of the movie, that would have been like, okay, time to go home.
Yeah.
Like, that's when you leave. Like, you don't just keep tracking after you've, like, grievously injured yourself.
Yeah.
But whatever.
Did she hurt her foot after they got stuck in the woods in that weird, like, time loop?
No, it was before. It was, like, at the beginning of the movie. They were, like, going along, and then she, like, fell and hurt herself. Yeah. Like, they weren't even freaked out or, like, lost at that point.
Yeah, no, that's one thing I really, actually, like, just that concept, the
time loop? Oh, yes. God, yes. I love that. Actually, you know what? Let's use this as a segue into the movie that one of the movies I was going to talk about. I said I was going to talk about Escape from Tomorrow. The other one that I was going to talk about is called Sam Was Here. Do you know that one?
That sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm not too familiar with it.
It's like a brand new movie. This came out in 2016 or 2017, so, like, either this year or last year.
Okay.
And it's basically about this guy who's some sort of traveling salesman, and it's in the 80s, so it's before cell phones, and he's kind of in the desert right outside of Los Angeles. And he's driving around, and it's sort of a bit of like a Twilight Zone episode where like there's nobody around, and he just keeps tuning into this radio station about this guy named Aaron, and it's like complain with Aaron or something like that, and or rant with Aaron, and they just like rant about stuff, and like you keep hearing this thing about some murderer who's on the loose and who's like done this awful stuff to kids. And,
oh wow, okay.
Yeah, and then like the main guy who's trying to get home keeps calling his wife and she's not answering, and he keeps getting these pages, because this is back in the days when they had pagers, and he keeps getting these pages that are like, you disgust me and you should be ashamed of yourself and all this stuff, and you're like, what the fuck is going on in this movie? And you know, they keep calling him a murderer, and they're like, oh, we found the murderer and blah blah blah, and so they're like coming after him, and to like protect himself he kills them. So technically he is a murderer. And then at the very end, they kind of capture him and kill him, basically. And you're like, what the fuck just happened? Because there's kind of a whole ending thing that's just like, I'm not totally sure what's going on here. But the description of it, I watched it on Shudder, which is that horror movie streaming. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the description of it was something really funny to me. It was like a Black Mirror episode if it was produced by the offspring of Rob Zombie and David Lynch. So it was basically like weirdly esoteric, but also like weirdly violent, and also like it didn't really give you a satisfying ending. So the reason that I brought that up when you said time loop is because that's what I think it is. And I honestly, like, this movie didn't even have a Wikipedia page, so I have no idea. The only thing it has is the IMDb page. And, you know, I tried to look it up, like, ending, you know, meaning, whatever, stuff like that, and I really wasn't able to find much. There were just, like, a few forum discussions here and there. So what I had been thinking was that it was sort of like a loop of some sort where he kind of was being punished. So they were calling him a murderer, but he became a murderer because they were attacking him and calling him a murderer. But there's sort of a weird thing about like something that he did to a child, and I don't really understand that part either. So it's a very confusing movie. But aesthetically, it was amazing. It was set in, you know, like the desert Southwest, and there was like this red light that was constantly flashing in the sky. And I thought maybe it was going to be aliens, but no aliens showed up, so that was a little sad, but it's okay.
Well, I mean, you know, it's all about interpretation. If you thought it was aliens, it's aliens. It just let it be however you want it to be.
The aliens were causing an unstable time loop.
Yeah, there you go. That works.
Also, it had a really good soundtrack.
Was it like, it sounds like the type of movie that would be like a lot of synth.
Yes. It was awesome. I liked it.
I love synth scores. That movie sounds really interesting.
That's what I liked a lot about It Follows. That had a fantastic soundtrack.
Yeah, Disasterpiece.
Yes.
His scoring has been like really. He does a lot of video game soundtracks.
Yeah.
He did the music for Hyper Light Drifter, and the score for that game is phenomenal. And then he's doing the score for a movie by the guy who did It Follows that hasn't come out yet. It's like a neo-noir film with Andrew Garfield.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I trust this guy. I don't know if has he done anything else?
I think he did like some small independent film before It Follows, like a more independent film than It Follows already was.
Like a couple $1,000 budget, and like if you're not acting, you're holding the camera, kind of low budget.
Exactly. I think that I heard that movie was actually pretty good, but it's like a teen film. It's not
something I would necessarily enjoy.
Probably not. But like it's more of like a drama, I guess. And yeah, it's just It Follows was a really sharp departure from him, but he had the idea for a very long time from what I remember reading, and
he delivered. Boy, did he deliver.
Oh yeah, man, that movie's rough.
It's solid.
That movie freaked me out.
It is. Legitimately, there were some parts that just like, and it wasn't even really jump scares. In fact, they were like sort of slow scares.
Oh yeah.
Which was amazing. And actually, it's kind of funny because I've talked about that movie before because obviously I loved it. Me and my other co-host, Zach, we went and saw it together. and then we talked about it, and we kind of dubbed that particular genre as doom horror, which is kind of like this deep, dark, overshadowing, like inescapable thing. That's the terrifying thing. It's not like a monster that you could just get rid of. It's like this whole, it's inescapable.
I remember watching it and seeing like just the way they executed this sexually transmitted curse, how they showed like the spirits, and like just the way that, like, the best example I guess of how they pulled off the horror of that movie was I remember the scene where they're on that beach. And like you see it's just a normal character that you can't see in the scene right now walking towards them, but then all of a sudden in a shot they keep cutting to, she comes like just playing along the water, and then you're like, wait a minute, how can she be there when she's already here? And then all of a sudden her hair lifts up and she gets yanked, and oh man,
and there's nothing there. Oh yeah, that was
good.
That
was
one
really clever.
Really freaked me out. The other one too was like where she was hiding up in her room, and like her friends were like knocking, and she didn't want to like open the door, and then she finally did, and like this big tall dude like came in behind her friends. Oh my god. Ugh.
Yeah, big tall stuff freaks me out, man.
Me too,
like
dude. Me too. It's like such a specific fear of mine. I am particularly afraid of giant humanoid things that eat people. So I'm afraid of the Cyclops, and I'm afraid of the Titans. Yes, it's terrifying.
Yeah, a giant purple people eater. Yeah.
One-eyed, one-horned hat. Okay.
But yeah, no, I remember seeing that, and I actually talk about that moment in the movie a lot, just because I'm like, it's a multi-stage scare. Like, it's almost like it's staged like a reveal.
And you have to really be paying attention to it, too. I mean, there's so many little tiny details, too, because, like, you realize that the form that the monster takes right before they go to the pool is her dad. And the only way that you know it's her dad is because you see his picture on her desk in her room.
Yeah, that movie's just like, there's so much subtlety to that.
So solid, and honestly I could talk about it forever, and I have talked about it previously. It's so good, and it's still like, it holds up. Like, I can watch it multiple times and still be pretty freaked out by certain points of it. Like, it's just that good. Yeah. So, okay, let's go to the other movie that you were going to talk about. So, The Killing of, I don't know.
The Killing of a Sacred Deer. Yeah, it's by Yorgos Lanthimos, who's done a few movies that I think you've heard about. Dogtooth, right?
I have. I tried to watch it, but there was like weird, vague prostitution at the very beginning that I just could not deal with.
Yeah,
I just stopped.
It's a tough movie to watch. There's no doubt. Not only like just because of the subject matter, but because of just Yorgos Lanthimos has a very particular approach to writing and directing, and it's very deadpan to the point of being like
very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's true. It's definitely uncomfortable, especially in his two most recent movies, The Lobster, which I loved. I love that movie.
I never got around to watching it. I really wanted to, and just didn't.
Oh man, it's great. It's darkly comedic, but it's also like kind of, it's like an absurdist comedy. And a dark absurdist comedy. It's fun. It's real fun. It's a real downer, but it's real fun. I guess that's a bit of an oxymoron, but hey, I'm running with it.
Just run with it.
Yeah, but The Killing of a Sacred Deer is definitely a more serious.
Is this an English language movie or no?
This is not his first. I think The Lobster was. He may have done something in the English language before, but I'm going to go with that. No,
I was just asking, was the deer movie, was it in English?
Oh yeah, The Killing of a Sacred Deer. Yeah, it's an English film.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a second movie with Colin Farrell. He was in The Lobster. Yeah.
I do like Colin Farrell a good amount. He was in Seven Psychopaths, which we both liked a lot.
Oh yeah. No, we saw that movie together. It was.
Before Justin was really legally able to go see an R-rated movie.
I have no idea what you could be implying there. I was totally legally able to see that movie. I did not sneak into it.
No, we definitely didn't buy tickets to see a different movie.
Totally not. We were A-okay to see the movie.
Law-abiding citizens.
We had great, honest chats with the employees there. They were like, "Oh yeah, you're seeing Seven Psychopaths because you're 18," and we were like, "Oh yeah,
definitely."
Yeah, no, great movie, regardless of the legality of us seeing it.
I was able to see it.
I was not. It was definitely me. It was my fault. I'm a wee bab. It's a problem.
So what's this movie about, or like the essence of it?
It's a really strange. It's got a bit of a history. Almost all the movies I have a really interesting backstory, just because most films do.
Yes, definitely. The last one I'm going to talk about, definitely.
Yeah, and no, I'm excited to get to that one.
Me too.
But yeah, so essentially, The Killing of a Sacred Deer is an adaptation of an ancient Greek play.
Oh.
Called, man, I'm gonna butcher this.
Okay.
Iphigenia and Aulis.
Alright, that seemed okay.
People listening, if you want to look it up, just look up King Agamemnon and just go from there. You'll be able to find it, I'm sure. But it essentially centers around Agamemnon, who is a leader of a Greek coalition at the time. I think it's before or during the Trojan War. I'm not exactly sure.
Sometime around that.
But yeah, he has to decide whether or not to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. But yeah, he has to sacrifice her to appease the goddess Artemis.
Okay.
And allow his troops to set sail to preserve their honor in battle against Troy. At least that's how Wikipedia's putting it in front.
Thanks, Wikipedia.
Yeah, I was reading about this as we were watching the movie, and then he has a conflict between himself being Agamemnon, and then Achilles over a young woman that I guess has to deal with a similar conflict. But it's supposed to be something that's very similar to the Iliad. It's kind of an epic. It was one of the... It's a play by Euripides, by the way, which I guess I should say. He's pretty important.
I would say.
But it's a tragic... It uses tragic irony quite a bit, and that plays into the film a lot. Just because it takes that central conflict and kind of runs with it a little bit. I realized both the horror films I picked were adaptations, but so this is more of like a psychological horror film. That's how it's billed, at least.
Okay.
But essentially, Colin Farrell plays this doctor who has has the nuclear family going on. His wife is played by Nicole Kidman.
Oh.
Yeah, she's in this. Fun fact.
Cool.
And then he's got a son and a daughter. But then he has this bit of a friendship going on with this younger boy named Martin. Anyways, so The Killing of a Sacred Deer follows Colin Farrell's character, his name's Stephen Murphy. He's a
pulmonologist.
There you go. Boom. There you go. But he's a surgeon. He's a surgeon. Specializes in anything involving the heart, which I do believe is cardiothoracic.
Maybe? I don't know.
So yeah, it actually opens with an open heart surgery. It's like a cold open with like music playing over that. Yeah, it's a good opening. It's real gory.
Real gory.
I mean, it looks like an actual, like they're performing an actual surgery. So
they did a good job then.
Yeah, either that or they just put a camera in a surgeon's. Whatever gets the job done.
I guess so.
He meets this boy named Martin, who he has this friendship with, and essentially he becomes kind of like a mentor to the kid. But then he essentially you get more of the backstory about why Martin and Stephen are friends later on in the film. But essentially what happened was Stephen was drunk during surgery. I guess kind of
killed his mother.
Not quite. Killed his father. And he essentially has been Stephen had no idea about this. He just kind of took Martin underneath his wing, and then Martin essentially reminds him after Martin invites him over to his.
So it's basically house. Blackmail.
Kind of. He invites Stephen over to his house and to meet his mom, and then Martin goes up to his room, and then his mom tries to get all weird with Stephen.
Oh, God.
And the mom, Martin's mom is played by Alicia Silverstone, who's apparently still alive.
Hey, don't be mean to her. She looks good.
No. I mean, I just haven't seen her in anything as of late. So, Stephen obviously is married and doesn't want to be with anyone. Also, something to note of that's just a really weird plot point is that Colin Farrell's character, Stephen, has this weird anesthesiology fetish.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Very early on in the film, like he and Nicole Kidman are like about to get ready for bed, and then she asks like general anesthesiology or whatever. I don't know if that's the exact term, but he's like, sure. And then she just lays out on the bed as if she's knocked out, and then he proceeds to do his thing. And
that's a whole situation. Okay, all right, well,
yeah, it's a weird movie, y'all.
Obviously, considering the director, God, I couldn't even get through like the first 10 minutes of Dogtooth.
Oh man, I remember when I realized what that movie was about, or at least my interpretation of it, because it took me a while to really like get my head around that movie. Cause
I can only imagine.
Yeah, and I mean, the movie deals with a lot of like pop culture stuff and also sheltering.
Yes, holy shit.
Yeah, seriously, and once I realized that it was kind of like, this is only surreal from a Western perspective, because anywhere else this is like really common. Like when that realization hit me, I was just like, this movie is brilliant.
That's wild, dude.
I really like Yorgos Lanthimos in general, but Dogtooth is a really good movie. At least, like, if you can get through it, I can understand. It's his stuff's hard to watch because of how bizarre it is and how deadpan it is.
Yes.
So yeah, it's not going to be for everybody. After he kind of doesn't hook up with Martin's mom, Martin essentially proposes to Stephen that since he killed his dad, that he has to now get rid of one of his family members.
Oh, I see. So it's like sacrificing one of his daughter, right? Like,
kind of, and that's where the movie gets really interesting. So essentially afterwards, they start developing these really weird symptoms, like they get paralyzed, they lose their appetite, and he's essentially just saying that this is going to happen, and it starts happening. And it seems to be like just by his presence. It's really strange. Yeah, and the way that this movie's filmed is very much, it reminds me of The Shining. There's a lot of weird tracking shots. The music's it's not really meant to be music. It's more of like mood.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of weird like bass frequencies and like swooshing. It's nuts, man. It's and eventually, like, I kind of like just want people to see the movie. I don't know if I should reveal what happens to the end, but it's kind of smart.
Yeah, don't.
Yeah, there's a reason it's compared to that play, and it doesn't go exactly how the play goes. Okay. Arguably, it's even worse. It's like insult to injury.
Okay.
But in a very subtle way. You just kind of have to catch it, and maybe you don't get that interpretation, but, it's an interesting movie. I would definitely recommend it.
Okay, yeah, so I guess you check that shit out. That's cool. Alright, so I guess we'll go to the last one then. And to be honest, the movie itself is not the most compelling thing in the world, and not even really what I want to talk about so much.
Okay.
Because it wasn't all that great. There was also a comparison to David Lynch, which I'm like, not everything that's weird can be compared to David Lynch. Like, stop doing that.
People use it almost as, like, marketing, because they know they're going to get a certain audience.
Right. It's either they're comparing something to David Lynch, or they're comparing something to Quentin Tarantino, and those are, or, like, comparing something to, like, Stanley Kubrick. Like,
yeah, honestly, a lot of people compared Killing of a Sacred Deer to Kubrick because of how cold and detached it feels, but also being very, like, meticulous.
Yeah.
But, I mean, like, it seems like anything that's, like, surreal in any fashion...
and doesn't have a satisfying ending tends to be compared to David Lynch.
Yeah, and, I mean, like, that's only, like, scratching the surface when it comes to his work.
Right, which I'm sure you can talk about ad nauseum.
Oh, yeah, no, I love David Lynch.
I know.
He's one of my favorites, yeah.
I like him a lot, too. But he is a big, smart man sitting in his big, smart man chair.
No, definitely. There's definitely a big, smart throne and his big, smart, and very strange brain.
Yes, exactly. This movie is called Escape from Tomorrow, and the cover of it is pretty obvious. It's like a Mickey Mouse hand or whatever.
Covered in blood, right?
Covered in
It's
blood.
got blood on it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. It's basically like Disney World's gonna be evil or something, you know? It's like, that sounds cute enough. There were so many weird little threads here and there, and it was also like very weirdly sexual about certain things.
Oh boy.
Yeah, well, it's like this guy who's a family man. He starts the movie off by losing his job, and then as they're going into the park with his wife and 2 kids, he sees these 2, I thought they were women at first, but really they're like girls. One of them had braces, and he just like follows them around the park for a good amount of time, and they're like French speakers or something, and he's just like, there's all this weird kind of imagery that's like vaguely sexual in nature and all this weird stuff.
Oh wow.
But what really stood out to me was that I noticed that the filming was absolutely really taking place in Disney. And
really?
I'm like, yes. And I was like, what the fuck? How did they do this? How was this okay? Like, all of this shit is copyrighted? What the fuck? So, I looked into it, and it turns out that this movie is what they call quote-unquote guerrilla filmmaking. Which means,
really?
Yes, they really did go into the park and film all this shit, and they were just using, like, cameras like regular tourists would use, you know, to just, like, film your family or whatever, and they just went in there, you know, acting like a real family, and got all this footage. They shot almost all of it on site. How amazing is that?
That's crazy. You know, I know, like, guerrilla filmmaking's not easy to pull off.
It's not.
Especially making, like, a feature film like that.
And this is about Disney. Disney is a behemoth, and they're so fucking serious about copyright stuff. Like, Disney is basically the reason that we have the stringent copyright laws that we have.
I mean, honestly, like, if they'd even caught wind that they were going to be there, they probably would have stopped them.
Oh, absolutely. So, like, they were so fucking sneaky that they were successful, and the movie got out and was published and people saw it, but because it was so small of a distribution, so few people saw it, that Disney just decided to ignore it. They just didn't even say anything about it. They're just like, all right, fine, fuck it.
I can't imagine, like, if that film had been like a runaway success, like It Follows, how
It was bad. I mean, the thing is, it was bad. It was not a good movie, which is like such a disappointment because like it could have been really cool.
What made it bad?
The writing was not super great. The plots were kind of all over the place. There was like kind of this weird thing about a sickness that gets like brought up kind of early on, and then like he fucks this weird lady who's like, I don't know, she's supposed to be sort of a quote-unquote, I don't want to use the G word because it's a bad word, but let's use bohemian. Okay. And for some reason, he fucks her, and then he just goes back to the hotel, and he's with his wife, and then at some point, he just, like, steps on some glass and, like, cuts his foot. I don't know. It was just there. It just happened. And then he, like, gets kidnapped by the Siemens Company, which is the company that sponsors the big orb thing at Epcot.
Okay.
And that doesn't last very long. I thought that was going to be, like, the rest of the movie, but basically he, like, gets himself free because he, like, had bought Neosporin earlier for his, like, cut foot, and he had it in his hands, and he basically used it as lubrication to, like, get his hands out of the cuffs, and then, like, when the kidnapper dude comes back, he, like, somehow cuts his head off, and it turns out he's a robot.
Oh, okay.
And then he just escapes. And then that's the end of that. That just doesn't come back up again. And then the sickness thing that got brought up earlier comes back, and he basically dies from it. It was like cat flu or something like that. He's basically throwing up like hairballs. And also there was like a very extensive scene, like at least 30 seconds, where he's just sitting on the toilet shitting his brains out, which is like, nobody needed to see that.
You know, but why wouldn't you have that scene in this movie?
I mean, I guess so, but it wasn't just that. He was like shirtless and sitting on the toilet, and it was just like all the sounds and him like sweating and struggling. It was hard to watch.
Are you sure this isn't Lynchian? It sounds a little...
I'm not saying it's not Lynchian. I'm just saying you need to be a little careful with how often people are throwing that around.
I don't think David Lynch would necessarily watch this movie and be like, I'm glad I'm being compared to this.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm saying, is, you know, I mean, it had some potential. There was definitely some potential there. But anyway, so then he, like, dies from the cat flu. And then at the end, like, the last scene is basically somehow he's, like, alive again. And he's, like, married to the lady from earlier that he fucked for some reason.
Oh, Interesting.
And that's the end of the movie?
That makes perfect sense. Wow,
See? Yeah. Makes perfect sense.
What a narrative, what a cohesive conclusion to...
That's what I'm saying, is like, that's basically the consensus, yes.
You know, everything you presented to me sounds either hilarious or bad, but yet I still really want to watch this movie.
I guess maybe you should, just to, like, experience it. I think everybody should, to experience it. And now that you know what happens, I don't know, maybe it will be less bad, or maybe it'll be more bad. I don't know. But it's an experience.
I mean, I don't know, like, it really, like, that kind of, like, experience is strange, because, like, there are a lot of movies where there's gonna be a lot of shock value to it, like, but that
the
doesn't
30-second
that, like,
shitting scene.
Yeah, no, that'll do it, man. But no, it's just, like, if you were, like, the shock, once that goes away, it's very interesting to see is that gonna make this movie better or worse?
Yeah.
No, I mean, maybe they're trying to say something with that toilet scene, like, everything...
That's where it culminated all of the symbolism into the toilet bowl.
And that's obviously it. We solved the puzzle, man.
I'm glad, because I was struggling. So, yeah, alright. That's some movies that we watched recently.
Yeah, it was good stuff. Yeah, I would definitely... Yeah. There's a lot to Vampire that, like, we didn't have time to get to.
We could probably do a whole episode on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff with that movie, like how they made it, the history behind it. I mean, same with, obviously, Escape from Tomorrowland, which I didn't even...
No, it's just Escape from Tomorrow, but yeah, that's...
Oh, that's so strange. I think at one point it was called Escape from Tomorrowland, but
I think that would make sense, but, like, they actually got stopped by the copyright shit.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it would.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
I could definitely talk more about it, but I also want to know more about it, because, like, honestly, I thought it was going to be something... This is going to sound kind of stupid, but, you know, I loved Goosebumps growing up, and one of my favorite ones was the Monsterland.
Oh, yeah. No, that one's great.
Right? So I thought it was going to be something like that, where they would, like, get on the rides and things would, like, turn more sinister, and that's just kind of not really what happened. So it was... I had expectations that were very clearly not met.
I remember seeing some stills from the movie whenever it was, like, teased a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember, like, people were, like, kind of, like, saying it was this really weird, surreal experience.
It wasn't good. It was not good.
I think it came out, or at least it was being marketed about the same time as Beyond the Black Rainbow, but which is another really weird, surreal film.
So, yeah, this has been pretty long, so I think I'm gonna have us sign off. How about that?
Okay.
Thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate you cutting out some time to talk with me and everything.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. This was a fun chat.
It's fun, right? Well, we'll go ahead and sign off, so bye!
Bye!